Hello and welcome. I'm Peter Dobby. You're watching Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, beyond petroleum, time is running out for oil-producing countries to get their economies in order as the world transitions to green technology. We find out who the winners and losers are as global geopolitics are redrawn. Also this week, where are the self-driving cars? They were predicted to be on the road by now. We'll talk to the founder of a startup that's found a niche for his self-drive technology. Rich nations can spend their way out of the pandemic, but it's not a level playing field for all countries. Colombia's efforts to raise billions from new taxes are scrapped after deadly street protests. The transition from hydrocarbons to renewables is gathering pace. It's a transition that has the power to reshape geopolitical alignments as many countries become more energy independent, policing energy choke points at sea using political capital to cover for dubious regimes and catering for volatile energy prices could become redundant. There wouldn't, in theory, be a need for military bases in the Middle East for those periodic calls for regime change and all-out conflict. The United States has already reduced its reliance on Middle East oil thanks to the development of shale oil and gas fields. If there was any doubt priorities are changing, President Biden is pulling troops out of Afghanistan and shifting his administration's policies to the Pacific and, in particular, to China. Mr. Biden also set new goals to cut emissions and has received commitments from other world leaders. That leaves oil producers on notice. And there have been more warnings. UK energy giant BP forecasting a peak in oil demand within the next few years as the world transitions to cleaner fuels. That's backed up by analysis from energy consultancy Wood Mackenzie, which says consumption would begin a steep drop as early as 2023. It went further to say global oil prices could drop to around $40 a barrel by 2030 if governments push to reduce fuel consumption in step with UN-backed plans to limit global warming. That will be a huge shock to the budgets of the oil-producing nations. Revenues have already been falling. In 2019, oil revenue in the Middle East halved to $575 billion from more than $1 trillion in 2019, according to the IMF. Even before the pandemic, many oil-producing countries were burning through foreign currency reserves to pay their bills. Saudi Arabia has seen its reserves fall from a record $737 billion in August of 2014 to $428 billion in February of this year. So what does that mean for the oil-producing nations? Well, risk analysts Verisk, Maplecroft believe Algeria, Iraq and Nigeria will be among the first casualties of a slow-motion wave of political instability over the next 3 to 20 years. It goes on to warn that time is running out for Angola, Gabon and Kazakhstan, who failed to diversify their economies away from exporting fossil fuels. So let's talk to the author of that report, James Lockhart-Smith, head of market risk at Verisk, Maplecroft. He joins us on Skype from Geneva. James, welcome to Counting the Cost. So you're headlining two countries here, Iraq and Nigeria. What's the direction of travel for them, do you think?
Well, we think in this case, they're really examples of a broader trend. We looked at the entirety of net oil exporters across the world, and we really had perhaps two major takeaways from the research. The first was, despite all the talk around diversification, despite the Paris Agreement in 2015, despite the oil price crash in 2014, i.e. really compelling policy and price signals, almost no progress has actually been made yet in reducing oil export dependence. So once you control for variation in commodity prices, very few countries have reduced their level of export dependence. You really only have Norway and Qatar, and although Oman managed a bit as well, that's really to do more with production problems than the health of non-oil exports. Most countries actually doubled down on oil exports to plug that revenue gap. The second takeaway, I guess, is, and this is linked to why we've seen so little progress so far, is that diversification is really hard, and many, if not most, net oil exporters are going to struggle. And so Nigeria and Iraq are part representative of that a broader trend, particularly vulnerable countries. And if I could just sort of unpack that a little, if you're a country that has built your economy and your political system, your social contracts around producing and exporting oil, Finding another way of generating revenue presents a double challenge. The first challenge is economic, because you've got to build clusters of expertise, technology, bring in FDI with technology transfer, everything you need to build alternative and value-added industries. And the second challenge is political, actually building consent across society and political elites for changes to happen, changes that may threaten vested interests. And that's also really hard. Countries aren't unified actors that always make rational choices, but collections of individuals that often disagree. And then we have a context where it's essentially too late for an orderly, gradual energy transition. And so the probability of more abrupt shifts away from oil in major consumer markets in the years ahead has increased.
Okay, you mentioned the Gulf countries there. At the beginning of your answer, you tagged Qatar and Oman for different reasons. How are the GCC countries doing when it comes to diversification?
They're actually doing relatively well so far. I mean, if you look at, obviously current absolute export mixes, obviously hydrocarbons still make a significant share of them. But for example, in the case of Qatar, you can see it sort of trying to kind of creep up the metals value chain, as it were. But they have, I think the key point is that, they were certainly, they've shown slightly more diversification in recent years, certainly in the case of Qatar and Oman, and actually UAE as well is a very important positive example. But then looking further forward, they do have the institutions in place. They have the political will at a senior level to be able to make those changes. But of course, this comes with a very big caveat that there's a distinction to be made between political stability in general and then political fragility. So, for example, Saudi Arabia has one of the highest tail risk probabilities for extreme political disorder in the world in our data, despite its stability to date. And then you consider that, certainly in our research recently, we were looking at external break-evens, so what countries need to pay for their import bills. So in a future of potentially softer oil prices, you could still see a lot of downward pressure on standards of living. And successful diversification itself could also be politically disruptive by upending, more traditional sort of oil economy social contracts.
Barack Obama's much vaunted pivot to Asia never happened. Joe Biden is definitely pivoting in that direction, absolutely. What does that do to the relationship between the Gulf, the GCC, and friends of Washington within the GCC?
We wouldn't see well, first of all, just bringing it back to energy transition, I don't think we'd see an automatic connection between the US pivot away from the Middle East and towards Asia and the energy transition per se, because, I think as you alluded to, there are many, many different variables that play. Washington is making the calculation, unsurprisingly, that China is by far the most significant challenge that the US faces geopolitically. And then you have longer running changes in domestic political preferences in the US for a less interventionist role on the world stage. On the energy side, it's certainly true that US dependence on Middle Eastern oil has reduced already, but that is, so far at least, more as a result of the US shale revolution than because of energy transition. But we would see a future under energy transition where the Middle East does become less pivotal to US calculations, in line with, the latest policy moves we've seen out of Washington. And that would certainly result in geopolitical changes in the region. Now, those geopolitical changes could actually be positive insofar as once the permanent guarantee of unconditional US support is removed, leaders have to start talking to each other because they no longer have, in the case of US allies, they no longer have that sort of moral hazard of being backed by Washington, whatever happens. So it's been very interesting to see, comments from Mohammed bin Salman a few days ago around wanting better relations with Iran following reports of secret talks. And of course, all that with the caveat that there are still going to be many obstacles to conflict resolution, including, because of the role of Iranian, in particular, proxies throughout the region, and just considering that we're dealing with very complex multi-actor conflicts. But yeah, on the whole, we do expect a reduction in US influence there, and we do expect it to have a role in changes. And I think more generally, less influence from the US is also going to mean more hedging by key US allies. So, for example, Saudi Arabia's interest of a few years now in securing Chinese investment in Aramco.
James, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, Elon Musk forecast that his electric vehicle company Tesla would have self-driving cars on our roads by 2018. Well, it hasn't happened, probably due to the difficulties of mimicking our complex human behaviour and our very intuitive skill set that you do need to have, of course, to drive a vehicle. Despite that, there are numerous challenges to Tesla, including Alphabet's Waymo, General Motors' Cruise, Toyota and Honda too. All have yet to start making and trying to sell in any meaningful way self-drive cars. And that's even before we think about governments around the world green-lighting the necessary legislation. Wall Street tech giants and the manufacturers have spent billions of dollars in the pursuit of the AI Holy Grail, and all fighting for the same piece of road. But artificial intelligence and automated vehicles are also being trailed in other areas of the economy. And that's an area that three-year-old startup AIDrivers is pursuing with the automation of vehicles used in ports. Well, why ports? Well, the $17 billion a year industry is suffering from labour shortages, and its technology can be retrofitted to existing vehicles. So let's talk to the founder of AIDrivers, Rafiq Swash, who joins us now from London on Skype. Rafiq, welcome to Counting the Cost. So why are ports an easier starting point for this kind of technology?
Thank you for having me. Obviously, ports, the immediate focus for autonomous technology due to the desperate needs for mobility automations, and where these areas are privately or administratively owned behind the fence areas. So the support from the operators, and also the simplicity of the finite the environment complexity are minimum. On the other hand, that operation complexities are a lot sophisticated compared to outside the areas. So these areas could be easily administrated and insured for autonomous mobility.
Why did you target the port industry? Why not try to work with, say, the airport industry? Airports have some of the leading edge technology for moving planes around. Isn't there a natural overlap there? Or even, I'm thinking about railway stations, for example, as well.
Yes, you're very right. And airports also requires or has a similar infrastructure as a seaport. But the minimum, the mobility, the maximum safety measures for airports are very huge, because you're moving the aircraft, which is multi-million worth. And on the other hand, in the seaport, you're moving containers. And amount of containers moves a few millions every day compared to amount of the aircraft moves around.
You're saying, and you've said in the past, that you think your valuation will be $2 billion in a few years' time. On the face of it, that sounds like a lot of money. But with respect to you, Rafiq, that's chicken feed compared to the big hitters who are trying to get in there. How do you play catch up?
I like to say that we are already ahead of many companies out there. They're trying to get their technology out on the road, because they are not just behind trying to see how this technology can be implemented, but they're also behind the regulations of these technology can be incorporated or authorized or regulated on the public roads. But the area that we operate, obviously, we have a huge amount of needs and wants from our port operators. And also, we already understand ways this technology can be incorporated and regulated in this environment. So if we can incorporate it within the port industry and implement this correctly, safely, and reliably, and then this can be extended for our side as well. So that brings us probably ahead of many out there that they are missing that initial or fast stage of implementation knowledge.
Special Purpose Acquisition Company, SPAC. Why didn't you use it to go to market?
SPACs are a very recent, innovative way of taking the companies to IPO. And obviously, we can see that AIDrivers has the compelling business operation for a SPAC. I think we are looking at something, when the time comes, you never know. We don't have to go through some creative way of going to IPO, because AIDrivers has a very substantial the value to provide for the industrial side. So we do have a very good, compelling business operations and technology for both SPAC as well as IPO. So at the moment, we are very early stage, whichever comes first, or on the other hand, that maybe we will never let to be going that route. Maybe some other company will be interested to merge with us or acquires or other purposes of taking our experience on their board to accelerate their development.
You're clearly facing the same challenges that everyone else in this still new technology is facing. How long until we can reliably use self-drive cars? I mean, you're in London. Would I get into a self-drive car to go around the M25 at 70 miles an hour, peak rush hour right now? Absolutely not. If you came here, would you drive around Doha in a self-drive car at peak rush hour? Probably not comfortably anyway. I mean, lots of things have got to change, haven't they? Not least public perception of control.
Yes, and there are uncertainty when it comes to generalization of the traffic flows in the public areas, because you will always find someone may not follow the traffic rules, and that requires a true intelligence. At the moment, there are sufficient computing powers, and that can do almost complex processing, decision-making, a lot faster than how human probably think when it comes to processing large amount of information. Obviously, humans are extremely clever when they are doing the reasoning, right? But when it comes to navigating in a complex environment on the road, but there are, if we look at from a simplistic way, you have a set of rules that you have to follow. Change of lines, which line is connecting which line, and understanding those lines, and then understanding the object on those lines, how they are behaving, right? If this can be put in place and enforce it, the way the speed measures are implemented to get human drivers to respect the route traffic flows. Today, we have speed cameras. They are measuring our speed on the vehicles. We have to drive, as expected on the traffic flow. We cannot drive too fast, too slow. But as we are growing in this area, and we will come with the traffic rule law enforcement where people should drive, respective to the traffic rules. And the autonomous technology will be implemented to follow those rules. So when everybody doing, their part responsibly, and this technology can be provided with the reliability and safety.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Rafiq Swash there in London. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Spend your way out of the pandemic is the advice from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. That may be possible for rich countries, but many nations are under pressure to figure out ways to repay their debt built up during the health crisis. Attempts by Colombia's President Iván Duque to push through tax increases that would have kicked in next year have been scrapped. The country's finance minister resigned after days of protests against the plans that left at least 17 people dead. It was heavily criticised for punishing the middle classes at a time of economic crisis. More than 2.8 million people fell into extreme poverty last year. 500,000 businesses have closed, and the government's debt has soared to 108% of GDP over the last 10 years, including spending on the pandemic. The government needs more revenue to reduce the budget deficit, which is predicted to hit 9% of GDP. OK, let's get some analysis now with Jairo Lugo-Ocando, Director of Executive and Graduate Education at Northwestern University here in Qatar. Jairo, welcome to Counting the Cost. To what degree was the tax increase an ideology from the get-go, from the very beginning?
Well, it's the third attempt that the government has had to try to improve the finances of Colombia. President Duque has tried before and did not find the consensus. Remember that his government is part of a larger coalition that was able to keep him in power with the support of several sectors in the country. And yes, of course, the government misjudged the plan and had little consultation. And when you try to tax people for the eggs, you can expect a backlash. However, the government itself is confronting a big problem in its public finances. Remember that there is an increasing external debt that jumped almost $20 billion in 1 year, and that creates panic amongst the creditors of Colombia, raises the risk of their debt and, of course, the interest that they have to pay, and also has seen a decrease in the main income that that country has, which is exports. In fact, for the second year in a row, Colombia faced a deficit in the balance in the commercial balance, registering this year something like $2 billion in deficit, which is for a country that lives from export is a very big deal. So the government tried to introduce this tax reform in the country, where most of the burden was put upon the middle and working classes, and not enough was being done through the to avoid tax evasion. So yes, it reflects a bit of ideology, but also it reflects a bit of the challenges that the government has in front of itself.
How unpopular is the ruling party, and are the scenes we've seen on the streets a reaction to that?
Yes, of course. The current government in Colombia is becoming increasingly unpopular. He had just got rid of his previous Minister of Economy and has appointed Restrepo, who's a more conciliatory voice, trying to gain some political space, but he's losing a lot of his allies. You can see the polls suggesting that Gustavo Petro, the candidate of the left, is ahead now in most of the polls, and some predict that he can win not only the first but the second round of the presidential elections. Yes, it's not very popular. It's very few people would like to be in the cabinet at the moment. Duque has not shown himself to be as skillful in managing public opinion and implementing the program as his political mentor, of course, who was the former president, Álvaro Uribe.
Mr. Petro, however, has said he will simply print money to pay the bill of the COVID pandemic. That's quantitative easing. That's what that means. You just print cash, put it into the economy, and everything is okay for a matter of months. But if you carry on printing money, there are negative consequences to that.
Of course, like the inflation. And of course, we all remember the Weimar Republic in Germany, and that's something that many governments have in their mind, and particularly the government in Colombia, because Colombia has a strong tradition, with very few exceptions, of being very conservative in its finances. So Petro is probably one of the first persons who openly is talking about a more Keynesian approach. However, we see what that led in places like the neighboring Venezuela, where the government printed money, and now the money is worthless. So I would advise, if I was a position advisor, I would advise to be very careful with that type of policy. Of course, quantitative easing at the moment is necessary in many countries. That's what Bolsonaro has done in Brazil, for example, where he printed money and distributed that money through social programs. That's why Bolsonaro, even though he's a right-wing government, is not facing the same type of protest that you're facing in Colombia. What you got in Colombia is a government that wants to finance its way out of the crisis by simply printing, by an austerity program, and an opposition candidate who wants to get its way out of the crisis by printing money. So it's neither of them are in a good place at the moment, I would say. This type of crisis are addressed by increasing productivity, by improving the conditions and the welfare of people at the same time, and by balancing the economy. And those are things that are very hard to do in the middle of a crisis. Having said that, Duque has done some very interesting things with the economy in the past, and it might be able to come back. But politically, he's not at the moment in a strong position, and he could be facing very serious challenges.
Jairo Lugo-Ocando, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page with entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost from me, Peter Dobby, and everyone on the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. The news is next.